3:11 on a Tuesday, and the first explosion knocked the powdered coffee off the shelf above Staff Sergeant Bridget Kowalczyk's cot. She was already awake. She had been awake for the better part of an hour, lying on her back in the dark with her eyes open, listening to the river. The Helmand moved slow and oily at this time of year, this late in the season, and the sound it made against the clay banks near the perimeter was nothing like the water she had grown up near in Lorain, Ohio. Lake Erie in winter made a different sound entirely, older, more patient, but she had trained herself to sleep to whatever water was near, and the Helmand had been her lullaby for going on 4 months now, and most nights it worked well enough. The explosion did not work as a lullaby. She was off the cot and in her boots before the echo finished rolling across the valley. The second blast came 11 seconds later, closer, and she heard the distinct secondary shatter of the motor pool's corrugated tin wall taking shrapnel. Her hands found her kit in the dark, without her eyes helping. This was not a skill she had developed at Cop Caldera. This was a skill she had developed somewhere else, entirely, in circumstances that the other personnel at this small combat outpost would have found difficult to reconcile with the woman they called the pill pusher. She pulled the aid bag's sternum strap tight across her chest and pushed through the plywood door into the night. Outside, the green zone was on fire in 3 places. Not the compound walls, not yet, but the scrub brush along the northern irrigation ditch had caught, and the light it threw across the outpost was the color of old copper. She could see figures moving. Some of them were moving the right way. Some of them were not moving at all. She counted the stationary shapes from the entry control point to the motor pool without slowing her pace. 4. Then her eyes found a 5th near the base of the Hesco barrier on the eastern side, half sitting, half slumped, one arm extended, and the other tucked against the body in the posture that only meant one thing. The radio clipped to her vest crackled and fragmented. Someone was trying to push traffic, but the signal was being eaten by the terrain, or the interference from the fires, or both, and what came through was mostly fragments of panic with no usable information attached. It did not matter. She already knew what she was doing. The soldier at the Hesco barrier was a specialist named Aldama, 23 years old, and the chunk of jagged metal that had come over the wall had taken him somewhere in the midsection. He was conscious. That was both good and bad. He was trying to hold the wound with his hands, which was understandable and wrong, and she moved his hands with a firmness that he did not argue with, because he had no argument left in him. The scar on her left forearm caught the light from the fire as she worked. It was a long scar, wide in the middle and pinched at both ends, paler than the surrounding skin, shaped roughly like a question mark laid on its side. She had stopped noticing it most of the time. It had been with her long enough to become part of the landscape of her body, unremarkable as a knuckle. But in firelight it always seemed to resurface, to remind her of the cost of learning what she now knew. She did not think about that right now. She pulled a chest seal from the lower pocket of the aid bag and worked. Behind her, the outpost was still trying to organize itself. She could hear Staff Sergeant Tremblay shouting something about the QRF, and she could hear Captain Osei's voice cutting across his, steadier, giving directions. Neither of them had seen her yet. Neither of them had reason to think that whatever was happening at the Hesco barrier required anything beyond basic first aid. What neither of them knew, what almost no one at Cop Caldera knew, was that the woman currently managing a tension pneumothorax in the dark with a 37-lumen red lens headlamp had been doing this, in one form or another, for the better part of 8 years. They would find out before the night was over. It had started back in Lorraine 17 months before her enlistment, in a house that smelled permanently of industrial solvent and boiled cabbage because her father worked at the mill, and her grandmother still cooked the way she had learned to cook in a different country. Bridget Kowalczyk was the third of 4 children, and the only one who understood from an early age that the house on East Erie Avenue was not the last house. It was a first house, a launching point. The question was only what direction. She had watched her older brothers go to the mill, and she had watched one of them leave again, and one of them stay, and she had decided at 14 that she needed a third option that didn't exist yet in her family's understanding of how a life was structured. She was 22 when she enlisted in the army, older than most in her basic training cohort, and she had worked as an EMT in the 2 years between high school and the recruiter's office. This was important. The experience with trauma, with the machinery of the human body under stress, was already in her hands before the army ever got to her. The army simply formalized and deepened it. She went through the 68W pipeline at Fort Sam, Houston, and graduated near the top of her class. Her instructors noted 2 things about her in their evaluations. First, that she had an unusual steadiness under simulated stress. Second, that she seemed to be training for something harder than what she was currently enrolled in, as if she had calculated in advance that this was only a waypoint. She was selected for Ranger Regiment assessment in her 2nd year of service. The 75th Ranger Regiment at that time didn't have female rangers in a direct action capacity, but the battalion aid stations did have female medics attached in support roles, and Bridget had understood the distinction and made her peace with it in a way that suggested she had a longer game in mind. She spent 3 years at 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, out of Joint Base Lewis McChord. She deployed twice in that time, once to Nangarhar Province in 2007 and once to Kandahar in 2008. The scar on her left forearm came from Kandahar. A mortar round had landed 40 meters from the aid station during a TIC that expanded faster than anyone had predicted, and a fragment the size of a man's thumb had traced a path along the outside of her forearm, from the wrist almost to the elbow. She had been stabilizing a ranger with a GSW to the right thigh when the fragment hit her, and she had finished stabilizing him before she assessed her own wound, and the fellow medic who worked on her afterward had said something like, he wasn't sure if she was brave or stupid, and she had told him she wasn't sure either. She had left the army in 2009 with 5 years of service, a combat medical badge, 2 deployment patches, and a very specific set of skills that she was not entirely sure what to do with in a civilian context. The EMT work she returned to briefly in Lorraine felt like wearing shoes that were 3 sizes too small. She lasted 4 months before she walked into an Air Force recruiting office and asked what they had for someone with her background. The Air Force needed medical technicians. They needed them with field experience, with deployability, with the ability to function in austere conditions. What they got with Bridget Kowalczyk was something somewhat beyond their current requirement, and this manifested in small ways that her Air Force supervisors noticed and attributed to general competence rather than to the specific, demanding, classified environment where that competence had been built. She re-enlisted and completed her transition to the 4N0X1 career field, Aerospace Medical Service. The Air Force processed her prior service years, credited her rank appropriately, and assigned her to Ramstein Air Base in Germany for 2 years before the needs of the force sent her, in the spring of 2011, to embed with an army battalion operating out of Kop Caldera in Helmand Province. She arrived at Kop Caldera on a Thursday morning in March, coming off a CH-47 with 17 other bodies and a pallet of medical supplies, and the first thing the outpost's senior medic, Sergeant First Class Nwosu, said to her was something along the lines of good, because they were running low on ibuprofen and she could help him sort the formulary stockpile. She sorted the formulary stockpile. She did this without complaint, with meticulous attention, and with a speed that Nwosu found mildly impressive and attributed to prior pharmacy tech experience, which was incorrect, but which she did not correct him on. Kop Caldera sat on a flat piece of ground that had once been, by the evidence of the irrigation channels carved around it, some kind of agricultural processing area. The green zone pressed in from the north and east, the river valley creating a narrow corridor of vegetation and compound walls that provided concealment in every direction an enemy might want to use. The outpost itself was squared off with HESCO barriers and T-walls, and 2 guard towers that were never, in Bridget's entire time there, simultaneously occupied by people who were both fully awake and fully paying attention. The aid station occupied a reinforced room in the northwestern corner of the outpost, accessed through a plywood-framed doorway that had a green chem light nailed above it, because someone had decided this was more visible than a sign and had never been corrected. The room held 2 litter stands, a table of medical supplies organized to Bridget's satisfaction, a vital signs monitor that worked when it felt like it, and a refrigerator running off the generator that held medications, blood products, and, incongruously, 3 cans of energy drink that belonged to Private First Class Ibarra, who ran the aid station's administrative side and who Bridget had decided within a week of arrival was probably going to be a fine medic in another 2 years if someone spent the time working with him. She began working with him almost immediately, in the quiet hours between sick call and evening, teaching him things that were not precisely in the 68W curriculum as she remembered it, but that had been in hers, in one sense or another. Nwosu noticed this and said nothing for the first 2 weeks. On the 15th day, he caught her running Ibarra through a needle decompression simulation on a ballistic gelatin block she had improvised from materials she was not supposed to have access to in the quantities she had used, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and then went back to whatever he had been doing without comment. This was the closest thing to a conversation they had about her qualifications. The nickname came from a cavalry sergeant named Deeks, who had been at the outpost for 8 months and had developed a theory about Air Force personnel embedded with Army units that was not particularly generous and was not entirely without basis, given that his only previous experience with them had been an Air Force logistics officer who had managed to lose a pallet of ammunition by miscoding a manifest. Deeks called her the pill pusher the first time she did sick call, and gave 3 soldiers ibuprofen for knee complaints, and the name spread across the outpost the way stupid things always spread in small, bored environments. It stuck to her not because it was cruel exactly, but because it was funny, and because she did not react to it. And in the absence of any reaction from her, it became simply part of the outpost's vocabulary. She did not react to it because she had heard worse in Ranger Regiment, and because she had spent enough time in small units to understand that nicknames were part of the binding material, even stupid ones, and fighting them only made them load-bearing. What she did instead was get better at her cover role. She ran sick call with a thoroughness that began to actually impress Nwosu, because she caught things that a straight pill pusher would have missed. She noticed the arterial blood pressure asymmetry in Sergeant Deeks himself during a routine screening, and sent him for evaluation that ultimately revealed an aortic abnormality he would have continued ignoring for another decade. He stopped using the nickname for about a week after that. Then he started again, because gratitude and behavior modification are not the same thing. The scar on her forearm surfaced in conversations twice in those early months. Both times were in the context of someone asking her what had happened, and both times she gave the same answer. Minor accident during training. It was accurate enough to be defensible and vague enough to end the inquiry, which was the goal. The first incident that gave people pause happened in the 5th week. A routine patrol came back from the northwestern corridor with a corporal who had taken a fall from a compound wall during a cordon operation and had an obvious deformity in his right tibia. The outpost's protocol was to stabilize and medevac for anything beyond the aid station's capacity. Bridget stabilized the fracture, assessed the neurovascular status, and then asked Nwosu quietly whether they were within the medevac window or whether they needed to consider something else. Nwosu was uncertain. The weather was deteriorating. The medevac window was borderline. She told him she could manage a closed reduction if they needed to, that she had done it before under similar conditions, that she had the nerve block materials and knew how to use them. Nwosu looked at her for a moment, with an expression she recognized as recalibration. He said that wouldn't be necessary, that the weather would hold. And it did. The medevac came and went without incident. But the moment had happened, and it sat in Nwosu's memory like a stone in still water. Captain Osei was the commander at COP Caldera, a West Point graduate from Accra by way of suburban Maryland, precise and economical in his communications, in a way that she had come to deeply respect. He asked her about herself exactly once, about 6 weeks in, and she gave him the abbreviated version. Army prior service, 68W, 2 deployments, cross-trained to Air Force. He did not ask what the 2 deployments had involved. She did not volunteer the information. He seemed to file what she had given him in a category labeled sufficient for now, and moved on to the operational situation, which was, as it had been every week she had been at COP Caldera, deteriorating. The intelligence picture in their section of Helmand through the spring and into the early summer of 2011 was not encouraging. The village of Sherzad, 2 kilometers northeast of the outpost, had gone from cautiously cooperative to actively obstructive in the span of 3 weeks, and the indicators that Osei was briefing his leadership on suggested the obstruction was not organic. There were facilitators moving through the area. The IED pattern on the main road had shifted from opportunistic to deliberate, and the shift in pattern was the kind of thing that suggested someone with more tactical sophistication than the previous threat actors had entered the operational environment. Bridget was not in the intelligence briefings. She was the pill pusher. She heard what filtered down through the ambient information environment of a small outpost where walls were plywood and privacy was largely aspirational, and what she heard made her adjust several small behaviors in ways that she didn't explain to anyone. She began keeping her aid bag staged at the foot of her cot rather than hanging it. She did a full inventory of the blood products in the refrigerator and requested a resupply of one type and an additional stock of hemostatic gauze a full 2 weeks before they would have run low under normal conditions. She reconfigured the litter stands in the aid station so that both of them could be accessed from either side, which was a small thing that would matter enormously in specific circumstances and would be invisible until it did. Nwosu noticed the inventory request and approved it without asking her reasoning. Ibarra noticed the litter stands and asked her why she had moved them. She told him to think about it and come back when he had an answer. He came back 2 hours later with the correct answer, and she told him to remember the reasoning, because someday it would matter. He was 20 years old, and he wrote it down in a small notebook he kept in his left cargo pocket. The second incident happened 3 weeks before the mass casualty event, on a morning when the temperature had climbed above 107 degrees before noon, and the entire outpost moved with the slow, irritable deliberateness of people who were hot and tired and running on compressed time. A local national had been brought in through the ECP with a wound that his family described as a farming accident. And that was not consistent with a farming accident in several ways that were immediately apparent to anyone who had seen a certain category of wound before. Bridget had seen that category of wound before. She assessed him thoroughly, treated what needed treating, documented what she was required to document, and then told the duty officer, with a specificity that she usually reserved for clinical information, that someone with better Pashto than the interpreter they currently had access to needed to talk to this man before he was released, because the nature of his injury suggested he had been in proximity to an IED detonation rather than a grain thresher, and the detonation had occurred very recently, and that information might be useful. The duty officer that morning was First Lieutenant Brennan, who was 24 years old and not unintelligent, but who had not yet developed the kind of receptivity to information from unexpected sources that would come to him later in his career if he survived long enough to develop it. He thanked her with a politeness that was dismissive in its precision and processed the local national through the ECP with a standard release. The following day, Captain Osei found her in the aid station doing a restock check and asked her what she had observed. She told him. He asked how she knew what an IED proximity wound looked like versus a thresher injury. She gave him the abbreviated answer again. He looked at her the way Nwosu had looked at her when she'd offered the closed reduction, that expression of quiet recalibration. And then he told her he appreciated her telling him, and to come directly to him in the future with anything similar. It was the most either of them said to the other about what she actually was. The foreshadowing arrived 9 days before the event, in the form of a report from a patrol that had found 2 cache sites in the northern green zone emptied. Not destroyed, not confiscated. Emptied, deliberately, by people who had known the patrol was coming and had moved what they needed to move before it arrived. The implication was a level of intelligence about the outpost's operational patterns that was uncomfortable, and it shifted the texture of the outpost's atmosphere in ways that were small and cumulative, and that Bridget felt in the same way she had learned to feel certain environmental pressures in certain terrains. She did one more supply run with Ibarra 3 days before it happened, cross-checking everything, making sure the refrigerator was at temperature, making sure every item was where it was supposed to be, and nothing was expired. She ran Ibarra through a mass casualty triage simulation, using the litter stands and the floor space as a map. He did better than she expected. She told him so, and the compliment surprised him enough that he stopped and looked at her, and she told him to keep moving because a compliment wasn't a reason to stop. She went to sleep that Tuesday night with the sound of the Helmand in her ears, and woke up 11 minutes before 0311 without an alarm, which was something her body had been doing since Kandahar, and which she had stopped questioning. 0311 on a Tuesday, and the first explosion knocked the powdered coffee off the shelf above her cot. She was already awake. The first minutes of a mass casualty event have a specific quality that cannot be described accurately to someone who has not been inside one. It is not chaos in the way the word is usually meant. It is more like a sudden increase in the density of information coming from every direction simultaneously, more than any single sensory system can fully process. And the training for it is essentially a set of filtering protocols: what to attend to and what to bracket, what to act on immediately and what to hold. Bridget attended to Specialist Aldama first because he was the closest casualty, and because the nature of his wound was time critical. She worked the chest seal into position, checked it, packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, and did a secondary assessment while the outpost's defense was organizing itself around her. The third explosion came while she was finishing on Aldama, larger than the first 2, and she felt the pressure wave pass through her chest like a hand pressed briefly against her sternum. The HESCO barrier to her right shuddered. A guard tower she could see from where she knelt went briefly dark as its lights cut out, then partially came back. She got her radio working and pushed traffic to the TOC. She identified herself, stated she had 1 priority casualty at the eastern barrier, requested a litter team, and gave Aldama's blood pressure and respiratory status. The TOC acknowledged, and she heard Osei's voice on the net cutting through the background noise with that same precision she had come to rely on. Then the QRF element came through the north gate, and the situation changed completely. They had been ambushed in the green zone. The detail became clear over the next 90 seconds as personnel reached the aid station and the account assembled itself from fragments. The QRF had pushed out to respond to what had appeared to be a vehicle in distress on the northern track, which was the pattern the emptied cache sites had been preparing for. It was a complex ambush with an IED initiation point and a linear ambush element, and a third element that Bridget would hear about later in a briefing, but which she was currently too busy to think about. The QRF had 4 vehicles. 2 of them had made it back. The other 2 were still on the track. 6 casualties came through the gate in the first wave. 2 ambulatory, 4 on litters carried by soldiers who were themselves injured in ways they had not yet processed, because processing injury requires a pause, and there was no pause available. Bridget assessed the room in the 3 seconds before the first litter reached her. 2 litter stands, 1 floor space she had kept clear. Ibarra at the supply table, white-faced, hands at his sides, waiting. She told him quietly and precisely what she needed, and where it was and what order to bring it in. And something in the way she said it moved the fear out of his face and replaced it with the specific focus that good training produces. He moved. Nwozu came through the door at roughly the same moment as the second litter. He took in the scene, took in Bridget's positioning, took in the way the first 2 casualties were already staged and prioritized, and he made a decision in a way that he would later describe to Ose as instinctive. He went to the second litter and followed her lead. The 6 casualties in the first wave had a range of injuries that she triaged and sorted in the time it takes to describe the process. She was working through the 4th one, a sergeant named Villarreal Campos with a GSW to the right forearm and a second wound to the calf that had chewed up muscle but spared the bone when the second wave arrived. Second wave was 3 more. One of them was in full traumatic arrest. She assessed him for 12 seconds and moved on, not because she didn't care, but because 12 seconds of assessment told her what it needed to tell her, and the remaining time was needed elsewhere. This was the arithmetic of mass casualty medicine, and it was the part that nobody who had not done it could quite understand from the outside. The worst casualty in the second wave was a staff sergeant named Priwet, who had taken blast injury to both legs and had a tourniquet on the right that someone had applied correctly under fire, and a tourniquet on the left that someone had applied with good intentions and poor technique. She corrected the left tourniquet without removing the first one, which would have been the instinctive but wrong choice, and Priwet, who was conscious and responsive and in a level of pain that was evident in the structural pattern of his breathing, gripped her forearm as she worked. His hand found the scar on her left forearm, that long, pale question mark, and she registered the grip and did not stop moving. She told him he was doing fine, or something close to that, words designed to slow his breathing, and his grip loosened fractionally. The 5th soldier to arrive through the door under his own power was Sergeant Deeks, who had a laceration to the scalp and a concussion he was still refusing to acknowledge. He was trying to give information to whoever would take it, telling anyone in the room what the QRF had seen on the track, the vehicles still out there, the personnel still unaccounted for. He was also, she noticed in passing, not looking at her the way he usually looked at her. He was looking at her the way people look at something they are trying to understand the dimensions of. She told him to sit down on the floor against the far wall, that she needed him to stay awake and tell her his name and the date every 90 seconds, that he was going to be a monitoring task for Ibarra, and that this was important. He sat. Ibarra took him on. The 3rd wave was 2 more casualties from the recovery element that had pushed out to retrieve the disabled vehicles. One of them was Corporal Agahae, who had the kind of penetrating abdominal wound that she had the supplies and the knowledge to manage temporarily, but not the capacity to fix permanently, and whose transfer to a surgical capability was not optional. She got him stable enough. That was what she had. For the next 47 minutes, the aid station at Cop Caldera was the operational center of the outpost in a way that had never been planned for or anticipated. Ose came through twice, received sit-reps from Bridget each time in the same crisp format she would have used for any command element, and left each time with the information he needed. The medevac request went up to higher, and the first HH-60 Pave Hawk was inbound in 23 minutes, which was faster than the normal window. And she would learn later that Ose had made a specific phone call to make that happen. She worked through all of it, the airway on Villarreal Campos that closed up on her unexpectedly and required a nasopharyngeal airway insertion that she performed without hesitation and without warning anyone in the room, because there was no time to warn anyone. The IV line that blew in Priwet's right arm and required a second attempt that she found in his left hand on the first stick. The cardiac monitoring on the two most critical casualties that required her to keep a mental clock running while her hands were doing something else entirely. She reached into the aid bag at one point for the hemostatic gauze on the lower right and found it empty, and said something specific to Ibarra, and he had it in her hand in less than 4 seconds. That moment was smaller than everything around it. She noticed it anyway. The medevac lifted out with the 4 priority casualties at 0458. By that time, the aid station had processed 12 casualties, 3 of them priority, and of the 12, 11 were alive. The 12th had come through the gate in traumatic arrest and had left the aid station the same way. Nwosu sat in the chair by the supply table after the last medevac lifted and put his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor. He stayed that way for a while. The light through the aid station's one small window was the beginning of dawn, grey and provisional, and it made everything in the room look like it was still deciding whether to exist. He said something to her, eventually. It was not eloquent. It was something about the fact that he had been a combat medic for 11 years, and he was trying to figure out how he was going to file what he had just watched in the category of things he thought he understood about medicine. She told him she had been doing this a while. He said he could see that. He asked where. She sat on the edge of the litter stand she had not used for a patient, the one in the corner, and she told him. She told him about Fort Sam Houston, about the 68W pipeline, about 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, and what it had meant to be assigned there as a medic in a support capacity. She told him about Nangarhar in 2007, about Kandahar in 2008, and she told him, without holding up her arm or making a production of it, that the scar on her left forearm was from a mortar fragment in Kandahar, from a night when she had been elbow deep in a casualty's thigh wound when the round came in, and that she had finished the job before she looked at her own arm. Nwosu listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something like, "So you knew?" She asked him what he meant. He said she had been prepared. The supplies, the litter placement, the training runs with Ibarra, the resupply requests 2 weeks ahead. She had known something was coming, or something like it was possible, and she had prepared for it. She told him she hadn't known exactly. She had read the indicators and prepared for a range. He said that was the same thing. She didn't argue with him. Captain Osei found her at 0620, sitting outside the aid station against the Hesco barrier on the east side, the same one Aldama had been staged against, watching the sun come up over the green zone. Aldama was on his way to Bagram. He was going to be fine, the surgical team had confirmed, and this information sat in her like something warm. Osei sat down on the ground next to her without preamble. The morning was already beginning to heat. He asked her, in a way that was not quite a question, why she had not put any of the Ranger Regiment context in her personnel file, at least not in the portions accessible to him. She told him the relevant portions were filed where they needed to be filed, and that her current assignment was for N0X1 with the task of supporting his aid station, and that the Ranger service was a prior life. He looked at her for a moment. He said something like, that prior life was apparently not entirely prior. She acknowledged this was a fair observation. He told her she had done exceptional work that night. He said it without the inflation that official commendations often require, just in his natural voice, and it landed with the weight of something he meant rather than something he was obligated to say. She said she had done her job. He said yes, and so had Ibarra, and she had had something to do with that, and he wanted her to know he had noticed. He stood up, brushed the dust from the knees of his ACUs, and walked back toward the TOC. Sergeant Deeks came to find her an hour later, head wrapped in a bandage that Ibarra had applied with more care than his usual work, the concussion beginning to announce itself in the careful way he was moving. He stood in front of her for a moment without saying anything. Then he said something like, he had a thing or two to revise in his thinking. She told him she appreciated him saying so. He asked her, with the directness that was actually one of his better qualities when he chose to use it, whether the pill pusher thing had bothered her. She looked at him for a moment. She told him no, not the way he meant. She told him she had been called worse by people whose opinions she'd valued more, and that it hadn't been an inaccurate description of what she was doing at sick call, and that names were noise most of the time. He seemed to think about this. He said something about how that seemed like a lot of patience for someone with her background. She told him patience and silence were not the same thing. He said he was starting to see that. He never used the nickname again. Not because she had corrected him, but because the name no longer described what he saw when he looked at her, and he was smart enough to update his vocabulary when the evidence required it. Ibarra sought her out the afternoon of that day, after he had slept for 3 hours on the supply table with his notebook folded under his cheek, and he asked her something she had not expected. He did not ask about the Ranger Regiment, or about the scar, or about any of the things the others had asked about. He asked her how she had known that he would be able to do what he did when she had started training him for it. She told him she hadn't been completely sure, that she had bet on it based on the way he moved, and the way he listened, and the way he wrote things down, rather than assuming he would remember them. He thought about this. He wrote something in his notebook. She asked him what he was writing. He showed her. Pay attention to how people listen. She told him that was a reasonable lesson. 3 weeks later, a transfer order came through for Bridget that moved her back to Ramstein for a rotation wrap before reassignment. She packed her kit in the same systematic way she did everything, organized the aid station's supply log for whoever was coming in after her, and ran one final training session with Ibarra that covered the mass casualty triage principles they had only been able to discuss afterward in those weeks since the event. On her last morning at Cop Caldera, she sat again by the eastern Hesco barrier. The Helmand was doing what it always did, moving slow and patient along its banks, and the green zone was lit in the early morning in its particular way, the light hitting the top leaves of the vegetation first and filtering down through the layers in a kind of slow illumination that had nothing to do with speed or urgency. She stayed there for a while. The scar on her left forearm caught the morning light. She looked at it the way she had looked at it on and off for 3 years. That long, pale question mark laid on its side. And what had changed was not the scar, but what it felt like to carry it. It had always felt like a reminder of a specific night in Kandahar, the smell of burnt propellant and the sound of the medevac, the way her arm had looked when she finally checked it. Now it felt like something broader, like an origin, not just for the scar, but for everything that had followed from the knowledge purchased at that price. She did not regret the nickname. She did not regret the silence she had maintained around her background, or the 4 months of sorting formulary stockpile and handing out ibuprofen at sick call. She had learned a long time ago that competence doesn't require an audience. The work is the work whether anyone is watching or not. The litters were placed correctly before anyone knew they needed to be placed correctly. The gauze was stocked before anyone knew it was going to run out. That is the only way it actually works. Here is what Bridget Kowalczyk's story teaches us. And it is not a lesson about silencing doubters or proving people wrong. It is something smaller and more useful. There is a specific kind of discipline that involves doing the full work when no one is measuring it. Not the minimum that the situation currently seems to require, but the maximum that the situation might eventually demand. Bridget sorted inventory and ran sick call and trained Ibarra in the quiet months before the crisis, not because she knew the crisis was coming, but because she had learned that the gap between preparation and performance is always paid for by someone, and she had decided a long time ago that she was not willing to let someone else pay it on her behalf. The litter stand that moved 12 inches in a corner of an aid station in Helmand province in 2011 probably looked like housekeeping. It was not housekeeping. It was a decision made in the absence of evidence, based on a probabilistic reading of an environment by someone who had spent enough time in similar environments to know what the evidence might eventually say. When the moment came, that 12-inch adjustment was the difference between being able to access a casualty from both sides and not being able to. Nobody saw her move it. Nobody would have noticed if she hadn't moved it. She moved it anyway. This is what she had. Not a desire to be recognized, not a resentment of the dismissal, a simple, stubborn commitment to doing the preparation that the work actually required, regardless of whether the work was being watched. Whatever you do, wherever you do it, that standard is available to you. The full work, not the visible work. The preparation before the need, not the response after the crisis. It does not require an elite background or a classified service record. It requires only the decision to take the job seriously enough, to ask what it might ask of you before it asks it. If this story stayed with you, if there is something in it that felt true to something you know about work or service or the quiet discipline of people who do not announce themselves, leave a like so more people can find it. And leave a comment. Have you ever prepared for something that no one else thought was coming and been right? What did that preparation look like? I'd genuinely like to know what that experience is for people in different fields and different lives. If you haven't subscribed yet, do that and turn on the notification bell, because new stories come regularly, and the bell is the only reliable way to hear about them. Bridget Kowalczyk sorted formulary stockpile and moved a litter stand 12 inches and ran drills with a 20-year-old Ibarra who wrote things down in a small notebook. And when the night came, none of it was wasted. That is the whole story. That is enough.